In June of 1894, Albert Michelson, the American physicist, stated that there was very little to be discovered by science. 6 years later, Lord Kelvin made a similar statement when he turned around and he said that everything now, all we need to do is define science to approximately 6 decimal points. In 1900, Max Planck, in his attempt to explain the photoelectric effect and the electromagnetic disaster, as it was termed, came up with the idea that energy came in quanta rather than as a continuum. Suddenly everything changed. These days we have what David Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness. The idea of how in each of this room there are brains. Those brains are effectively made of chemicals and electrochemicals putting pulses through the brain. How does that create your inner life? How does that create your hopes, your fears, your anticipations? Every single person in this room knows quite categorically that they have an inner life. There are certain materialist reductionists like Daniel Dennett and the Churchlands who will actually deny that there's any inner existence. I'd like to know who Daniel Dennett thinks writes his books, and I'd like to know who Daniel Dennett thinks spends his money that he gains from his books. But this is the way science thinks it is. It knows everything. So therefore, the 70% of you in this room that have had a déjà vu experience at some time in your life, do you know it's because one of your eyes is processing information, or one of your visual fields is processing information slightly quicker than the other visual field, and therefore you're actually getting the message twice? A series of experiments have been done up at the University of Leeds by somebody called Akira O'Connor. They discovered that people who are profoundly blind and born blind have déjà entendu. They actually hear things twice. Now, the visual pathways in the brain work completely differently to the hearing pathways of the brain. So therefore, what was called the Efron hypothesis of the déjà vu phenomenon actually is now out of the window. But we don't hear a great deal about that for some reason. We also discussed earlier on the phenomenon of sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis is a fascinating phenomenon, and it's brought about by something called REM intrusion, where effectively you are in a semi-hypnagogic state, where the melatonin release is actually in conflict with other areas of release within the brain and neurochemicals. So therefore you sense that there's something else in the room, or that you're out of your body. However, that doesn't explain anything. All it does is give a narrative of what's going on. Modern science loves giving labels to things. Have you noticed? When somebody has these experiences, everybody turns around and says, it's an hallucination. Then ask the scientists what they mean by an hallucination, and suddenly you get all kinds of waffly answers. An hallucination is an inner experience. Effectively, it's called an hallucination because one individual experiences it. Therefore, it's an hallucination. If 2 individuals experience an hallucination, which does happen, it's a folie à deux. If a great amount of people experience something similar, it's called a collective delusion. These are all nice labels, aren't they? But they don't actually tell you anything. You have to reduce things back to the base facts of exactly what we know. And the question is, as Ramachandran, the neurologist, turned around and said in one of the Reith lectures a few years ago, how does this jelly in my head create the sense of red? How do scientists explain qualia? How do they explain the inner experience that we have? This is the mystery. So therefore, if consciousness is just simply an epiphenomenon of brain actions, there's still not an answer. For instance, we can match brains. We can MRI scan a brain, and we can actually match on a one-to-one the idea of what is happening in the brain with what the person is experiencing. Yeah, totally agree. But then again, if you take the back of a television set off and you look at what's happening with the valves, or as it used to be the valves and the various things that are happening in the TV set, you can actually tell what's on the screen. But of course what's on the screen isn't in the television set alone, it's in a studio miles away. It could be a film that's filmed many, many years ago. So therefore the argument to say that because we can match one-to-one with what's happening in the brain means we therefore understand what self-referential aware consciousness is, that's a huge leap. Chalmers' hard problem is the hard problem, because there is no possible way that consciousness can exist within a physical universe. How on earth does your brain create you? And this is the mystery. And therefore, if your brain creates you, therefore, where is it drawing that information from? In many ways, one of my recent books I wrote was actually on the out-of-the-body experience. And I went into great detail about the way in which it is when people have out-of-the-body experiences, what they perceive is not necessarily what is out there. So in other words, wherever they're going when they have a near-death experience, whenever they have an out-of-the-body experience, remote viewing, near-death experience, and everything else, they seem to be sharing, they're going into a universe that's not quite this one. There's this kind of curious change. There's many, many cases, people like Robert Monroe, when he had his out-of-the-body experiences, what he saw in his out-of-the-body experiences was about 50% right and 50% wrong, which suggests that the experience is a real experience, but not within consensual reality as we understand it to be. Now, if this is the case, we then need to start looking at exactly what is happening inside the brain when we have these experiences. My latest book, I deal with dimethyltryptamine. I deal with how dimethyltryptamine is actually potentially released in the pineal gland of the brain. And before people turn around and say there is absolutely no evidence of that, I suggest they read up the latest research by Jimo Boragin at the University of Michigan, because they've actually found DMT in the pineal glands of live rats. Fact.
What's your name?